Hi, everyone. My name is Jesse Toufexis, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 6th episode of Meet the Author, presented by the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies. Our featured author today is Francis Muss, who is joining us to discuss his excellent new book, The Demons of Leonard Cohen. Before I tell you more about Francis and introduce our special guest interviewer, Dr. Chantal Ringuet, a few words about the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies. The Association for Canadian Jewish Studies is the only academic society dedicated solely to the study of the Canadian Jewish experience. Our organization is multidisciplinary, and we encourage interdisciplinarity. We publish the annual journal Canadian Jewish Studies, or Études Juives Canadiennes. We also publish a newsletter twice a year and hold an annual conference. Because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we had to cancel our 2020 conference, and we decided to inaugurate our online events instead, such as this. In addition to this Meet the Author series, we are organizing a number of online panel sessions. Our first session, broadcast on July 28th, was on harassment and hate online, realities and remedies. It's available for viewing on our YouTube channel, and please subscribe to our channel to find out more about upcoming events. At the end of the interview, you'll find information about the ACJS, and we strongly encourage you to join the association and support its mandate to deepen our understanding of the Canadian Jewish experience. You'll also find information about ordering Francis's book with a discount code. It's my pleasure now to give a proper introduction to our two guests. So I'll start with our interviewer, and then we'll go to our author. Our interviewer, Chantal Ringuet, is a Canadian award-winning author, scholar, and translator. She is the author of collections of poems and of a cultural synthesis and an anthology on Yiddish culture and literature in Montreal. With Gerard Rabinovich, she published Les Révolutions de Leonard Cohen, which received the 2017 Canadian Jewish Literary Award. With Pierre Anctil, she has published a translation of the early biography of Marc Chagall. She's been a fellow of the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research in New York, scholar in residence at the Hadassah-Brandeis Institute at Brandeis University, and writer in residence and literary translator in residence at the Banff Center for Arts and Creativity. Chantal, welcome to the show, and thank you for doing this.
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be with you today. Mazel tov, Francis. Congratulations on the publication of your book in English, translated by Laura Vrooman and published by the University of Ottawa Press.
Now I will introduce our author. Francis Muss is a research fellow at the University of Antwerp in Belgium. Between 2006 and 2010, he wrote a PhD dissertation at the University of Leuven in Belgium, in which he studied the internationalization of the Belgian avant-garde movement. He pursued his research activities in Lille and Liège and worked on several projects dealing with the international circulation of literature and music. In 2015, he published in Dutch a monograph on Leonard Cohen, which earned him the literary prize of the province of East Flanders in Belgium. He's given numerous lectures on Leonard Cohen, and he's published extensively on this topic, amongst others in Chantal's aforementioned award-winning book on Cohen. During the writing process of this book, he spent several research days in Canada, amongst others at the University of Toronto, where Cohen's papers are kept, and at McGill University with Professor Brian Traherne, who wrote the preface of this book. Francis, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
I will be the other interviewer as well as your host. In addition to serving as the co-organizer of this series of online events with Richard Menkis of the University of British Columbia, I am a PhD student at the University of Ottawa in the Department of Classics and Religious Studies with a research focus on North American Jewish fiction. Francis, I'll ask you a question to start, and then I'll hand it over to Chantal. Could you start by telling us just a little bit about yourself, where you were born, where you grew up, where you studied, and what drew you to this topic that seems rather far afield for your geographic location?
Well, it depends on how you see it, because at a given moment, Leonard Cohen was much more popular in Europe than in Canada or in the US. As you maybe know, one of his most famous albums, Various Positions, wasn't even released in the United States, whereas it contained the track Hallelujah. But in Europe, he has been popular throughout his whole career, starting in the late 60s. But you are right, I'm a Belgian and Belgian scholar. I'm a research fellow at the University of Antwerp. And as you mentioned in your introduction, I wrote a PhD on the Belgian avant-garde. So you will agree with me that this has very little to do with Leonard Cohen. However, I went to Montreal during my PhD for a research stay. It was in 2008, I think. And in the same year, I saw my first concert in Bruges of Leonard Cohen. And then 2 years later, I think I started writing a book. And therefore, I came back several times to Canada, research stays in Toronto, in Montreal, and so forth. And in 2015, the Dutch book was released. And I'm very happy that we have the translation now. In fact, it's rather a second book disguised as a translation.
All right, great, thank you. Chantal, thank you again for joining us. And now it is your turn, fire away.
Thank you. Now, this is an extensive work that analyzes Leonard Cohen's multiple personas and that situates him as an artist whose practice can be read, quote, as an attempt at forging interpersonal contact, as mentioned on the back cover. There is a lot to say about this book. It is a very appealing monograph with a beautiful graphic design, many colorful images, and reproduction of archival documents. Moreover, it is accessible to a large readership. Now, regarding the title, The Demons of Leonard Cohen, we refer here to the original Greek mythological meaning of daimon, D-A-I-M-O-N, like Socrates, to tutor, deity, or guiding spirit, which is also a provider, divider of fortunes or destinies. Here's my first question. How can we interpret Cohen's demons? Can you tell us about the relationship between persona and work?
That's a difficult question. First of all, you are absolutely right. I'm referring to the original Greek mythological meaning of the term, in which the daimon is not necessarily a negative figure. The daimon nestles itself on somebody's shoulder, incarnating that person's identity. And the idea is that it is only in the outside world, through contact with other people, that the daemon's presence manifests itself. And you have the same idea with mirrors. And that's also one of the reasons why you can see a mirror on the book cover, which I can show here. I think it must have been an interview of the late 80s in which Cohen refers to a story he has read in Dalva. It's a novel by Jim Morrison, who is speaking of certain tribes where the white man tried to introduce the mirror. And certain Native American tribes refused to accept the mirror. The reason was, they said, that your face is for others to look at. So there again, you have the same idea. And my hypothesis is that in each song, in each poem, in each concert, we are confronted with these daimons, with these identities, with these guises, with these various positions who provide a glimpse of Leonard Cohen's dialogical self. His identity keeps assuming new forms depending on the other to whom the self turns time and time again. Therefore, I also chose the plural, demons, of my book. So I do not want to defend a psychological biographical reading of the work. What I'm interested in is the intriguing dynamic between the artist, between his work, and between his audience. So we have daimons, we have mirrors, we also have masks. The different demons can also be seen as identities or embodiments, as masks. And in the book, I include a picture of a mask which was crafted, which was made by a friend of Leonard Cohen, Martin Rosengarten. And the anecdote is described in the biography of Sylvie Simmons, but she never saw the mask. And I asked Martin Rosengarten to look for it, which he did, and I still am happy with that. And he sent me the picture with the mask. So the idea of Cohen was, it was crafted in the early 70s, that he would wear the mask on a stage to incarnate a different persona. He never realized that ambition, but the idea was there. And I think if you read his works, if you listen to the music, you are confronted with those different images or masks or diamonds or identities. And these identities I have wanted to show in the several chapters of the book.
Great. Now, you mentioned my hypothesis in this book is that these numerous roles, more than an innocent game, are experiments designed to confront the tensions and conflicts inherent in Cohen's life and art. Can you tell us more about the thesis of your book and why you decided to write it?
Yes, I argue that these masks or these demons or these identities are separate threads linking a body of works spanning 60 years. And this is why I have opted for a thematic rather than a strictly chronological reading. And I hope to show that Cohen's oeuvre is characterized by a striking continuity, justifies a thematic reading, and therefore offers scope for an interpretation that complements the existing bibliography. Besides, due to the wide international circulation of the music, the connection with the history of its creation has at least partially been severed, and much of the music reception has been filtered through those images created not only by the artist himself, but also by critics in the works, in the concerts, in the interviews, and so forth. And in that sense, my book is also a reception study on how Cohen, the different Leonard Cohens, plural, has been received in Europe, outside of Canada, both regarding the music and the literature.
And it's also important to note that this is not a biography of Leonard Cohen.
That's true, yes, because when dealing with pop music, one spontaneously thinks about biographies, and there have been many biographies written on Cohen. I did not want to add something to that, or maybe one or two little details, but the idea is I wanted to meet the artist, so to speak. So I could define my book as a biography, but the idea then is that I encounter the artist, that I meet the artist throughout his works. So I try to unravel, I try to see how the artist is trying to get in touch, to encounter his audience through the works. Because in almost every song, in almost every album, there is this spontaneous interaction with the other, with the listener. Starting from the very first song on his very first album, Suzanne Takes You Down, he's talking to the listener, to the very last album, You Want It Darker. It's not Leonard Cohen who wanted it darker, he is talking to someone.
Right. And a major characteristic of Cohen, you mentioned that already, it resides in his ability to move from one identity to another, and we could say to reconcile different cultures and religions. Speaking of identity, I wonder, to what extent can he be perceived as a Quebecois, a Canadian, a Montrealer, a North American, or even European? What would you say?
Difficult question. I think this is a very complex issue. I think there is a very clear evolution. While in his very early writings, you have a lot of specific references to Quebec, to Canada. They are fairly common throughout the literary work, but they disappear in the later music. Let me give you one rather anecdotal example. In the song Light as the Breeze, for instance, I think it's from 1992, you can still read in the booklet, in the lyric booklet, Cohen wrote, St. Lawrence River is starting to freeze. So there is the reference to Montreal, to Canada. But when he performs the song, when he sings it, he sticks to the river is starting to freeze. So I think that in the music, Cohen's imagination expresses itself through more general points of reference. A bridge, a river, a room, and listeners can picture these wherever they hail from. And this is what interests me in Cohen's work, how his music and how his words have traveled around the world and how they have been received in many different ways. And what you see is that Cohen situates himself at the outskirts, as you mentioned, at the outskirts of different places and traditions. And he does that in his own life, in his biography, but he also does that in his work. There is a kind of search, a quest for a intermediate space. And this can also be interpreted in a more abstract way, I think. Quite a few literary and musical traditions converge in his imagination. Cohen steers a deft course between a local embeddedness on the one hand and an international, at times even universal aspiration. He once said to Jennifer Warnes, one of his backing vocals, "Your most particular answer will be your most universal one." And I think this is what he tries to do. This is what he does. I'm living within that polarity, he added. And I think if you reread the works, this is exactly what happens. So you have both. You have both the local tradition where he came from, Montreal, Canada, Quebec, and the more universal international aspirations. He also combines different traditions, sometimes in a very explicit way. If you think about the Ballad of the Absent Mayor, it's a song from '79. He takes a Buddhist parable, a Buddhist tale, and he adapts it to an American Western situation. It's very funny. In the original version, you have a Buddhist, a small boy who is looking for a bull. And in the version of Cohen, it becomes a cowboy who is looking for his lost mare. So there are many references. This is very anecdotal, but you can see how he experiments with different intertexts, with different myths, to paraphrase his first poetry volume. And this is a continuity throughout his whole career, I think.
Yes. One of the things that I really liked about your book is also the cover images that you include. And I wonder to what extent we can read Leonard Cohen's journey and his work throughout the different cover images that are presented here in your book. What do you think about this?
Yeah, this was the idea of my first chapter. This is the only chapter that is chronologically organized, and I wanted to tell the story of the musical career of Leonard Cohen through those album sleeves. And I think if you juxtapose those sleeves, there is an evolution. You start with a very direct encounter with the artists. There are very direct photos on the cover of the album sleeves. And then at a given moment in 1979, he introduces a symbol on the cover of recent songs. It's a very small hummingbird. He already referenced the hummingbird in Beautiful Losers. But for the first time, you see a small symbol on the album sleeve. And then little by little, this symbolic language becomes more and more important. So in the left, or in the back, there is the small hummingbird. There is also a drawing of Leonard Cohen. It's not a direct photograph anymore. And you have this evolution because the more he continues to make music, the more this symbolic language becomes important. To the point that in 2004, for instance, you have the cover of Dear Heather, where you have two other symbols. The Order of the Unified Heart symbol, a symbol which he created himself, and then a Buddhist stamp, and it is a reference to his Dharma name, Jikan, which means the silence between two thoughts. So you see how Leonard Cohen is still present, he is still there, but more and more in a symbolic way. And I think this is one evolution in those album sleeves that one can detect if you compare them one to another, that there is a very direct presence in the early 70s, and the image becomes more and more symbolic or iconic throughout the years. So this was the idea of the first chapter, and the idea of the symbol is also important in Cohen's work. For instance, in his last poetry volume, The Flame, there is a drawing where he says, "Then let our symbols speak for us if we can't." So you see, there is a constant quest to find the right word, the right language. And from time to time, he uses an existing language, such as religious language, to speak out, to be comprehended by his audience.
Mm-hmm. If we go back now to 1966, which was actually a turning point in his life and in his career, with the publication of his second novel, Beautiful Losers. And at the time, it was considered partly as a kind of failure of his attempt to become a Canadian writer. And it's really a turning point because this is after this experience that he will start recording, and then his first album will be launched soon after, Songs of Leonard Cohen. Can you tell us about the international reception of Beautiful Losers? We know, for example, that the reactions were very different in Canada than in Britain. And can you develop a bit on the reception of this novel throughout the world? And how was it different in Canada than it was in Europe?
I think Beautiful Losers might be the best example to illustrate how different and how difficult sometimes the reception or receptions of a work of art can be. So as you said, upon its release in Canada, the book had a rather ambivalent reception, but soon became known as the first postmodern novel in Canadian literature. And I think within the Canadian and academic perspective, it is the most widely discussed work in the whole of Cohen's career. The book has been portrayed as an allegory of Canadian society, as a literary experiment that is anchored in a very specific time and place. And for some readers and translators, maybe too explicitly tied to one specific place. I think it is Frank Davey who writes that it is unambiguously tied to Francophone Montreal of the 1960s. And of course, its experimental nature is manifested in the inextricability of form and content, of signifier and signified. So then the question is it possible for such a work to travel outside of the context in which it was written? Is it possible to translate this kind of text where form and content are so closely intertwined? It's a difficult question. And in the archives of Toronto, you can read the draft versions of the book, the manuscripts. And on one page, Cohen wrote in the margins a little note mentioning, "Don't follow the story, follow the emotion." Maybe it was an advice for himself when he was writing the book. Maybe he was talking to his readers, English-speaking readers. But it could also be seen as an advice to translators. And that was my idea when dealing with the international reception of the book. I try to analyze how the book has been received, but also how it has been translated, how it can or could be translated, how it has been received. And for instance, in the Netherlands, in Belgium and the Netherlands, there was a long review written by Gerrit Komrij, this very famous poet and critic here in the Netherlands, who was very negative. Let me quote. Do we have time for a quote? So he's saying, "Imagination, nil. Structure, nil. Originality, nil. Style, nil. Self-control, nil. Premise, nil. He takes offense at the formal experiment as such, irrespective of any distortion by or in the translation. Drivel, unnatural dialogue, and Cohenisms are clearly not descriptions of an experimental poetics, but explicit reproaches aimed at illustrating that Cohen does not write, but expresses himself, and uses punctuation, quote, that does not punctuate anything. So it was very negative. It was translated, but it was more seen as a collector's items for the music fans than as a real literary novel. And I think the situation in Canada is clearly different on that level.
Right. And one of the important quality of your book is that it is also the result of an extensive research in the archives that you did in Toronto, in Montreal, and elsewhere. And at the end of the book, we find very interesting reproductions of archival documents about À tout prendre, Take It All, a movie from Québécois filmmaker Claude Jutras, and its translation by Leonard Cohen that was presented at the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. So that's the main title. Can you tell us the story behind this document? And also, I wonder, to what extent does it represent Canada's duality at the end of the 1960s, marked by the Quiet Revolution in Quebec and a period of worldwide turmoil and emancipation?
A lot of questions at the same time.
You can take only one.
Okay. There is one letter from Cohen to, I think it was to his sister, in which he's referring to the book Two Solitudes, written by Hugh MacLennan. And he says something along the lines of, Hugh MacLennan has written nothing in his book, but everything in his title, Two Solitudes. So one could think that there is a clear divide between the Anglophone, who was Cohen, and the Francophone community in his hometown of Montreal. But I think this is not true. There are examples of collaborations, of encounters between Anglophone artists such as Leonard Cohen and the Francophone community of artists. And this is something that should be investigated more, because in the existing biographies, no one is mentioning that aspect. So I mentioned only one example, the collaboration with Claude Jutras. And I was struck that it was never mentioned in the biography, because Claude Jutras is known as a famous filmmaker in Quebec. So in 1963, he released a movie, À tout prendre, in French. And then 1 year afterwards, it was translated into English, Take It All, subtitles made by Leonard Cohen. And I believe there is also one cameo in the movie where Cohen appears with his guitar, playing guitar. It's a very interesting document because it's a very experimental movie. Take It All combines, so the English translation combines the English subtitles for the French dialogue with the spoken English of the interior monologue, so the monologue intérieur, as they appeared in the original version. So I was really intrigued by that document, and I was struck by the fact that nobody ever mentioned it. And it is even very difficult, it's very hard to find the English version in stores or in databases. I had to go to the National Library in Ottawa, to the National Archives in Ottawa, to find the two VHS tapes to have a look at the English version with the subtitles of Cohen. So yeah, I was very happy to find that collaboration between those two artists.
All right, so I think our time is just about up. So Francis, this has been wonderful. Thank you for doing this with us.
Thank you for having me. I'm very honored, and I really mean this, that you are inviting me to your platform, to your show, that you give me the opportunity as a European to speak of one of your icons. So it was a very humble, how should I say, a very humble try to understand something of the works of Leonard Cohen.
It was truly our pleasure. Chantal, thank you so much for taking the time to be a guest interviewer today.
Thank you. I was honored.
Thank you, Chantal, for the help throughout the years.
And I am Jesse Toufexis. Please keep watching so that you can find out information about joining the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies and to get ordering information and a discount code for Francis's book. Thank you for watching and stay healthy.